Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and especially emerging leaders. I love this motto that we have at amerikahaus MSc this year, emerging leaders. And I'm very pleased to welcome the emerging leaders on stage later on and you in the audience. So a warm welcome. My name is Maike Zwingenberger, and it's my great pleasure to start this kickoff tonight. This is the second event we have with that wonderful group of partners. Last year we focused on cybersecurity, and this year the focus of our speakers will be on climate change and implications for global security. Thanks to our partners, Bertelsmann Foundation, the German Foreign Office, the US Embassy Berlin, and the US Department of State, we have a great lineup of speakers. A very warm welcome to Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Board Member, Bertelsmann Stiftung, Kate Guy, Managing Director for Climate Security, US Department of State. As keynote speaker, we are very glad to have Sarah Ladislaw with us. She is the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the National Security Council, the White House. Welcome. Our panelists are Iris A. Ferguson, Deputy Assistant U.S. Department of Defense, Katarina Kertisova, Policy Officer with NATO, Dr. Kira Winke, Head of the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy, German Council on Foreign Relations, Janani Vivekananda, Head of Program Climate Diplomacy and Security with Adelphi Consulting, is also on stage. And because that's a wonderful and great lineup, I will be really quick. I just want to thank Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook as a moderator. I think she will be very dynamic and we will experience a very well-structured conversation. And thanks to our partners, this great panel will be on stage later on, and I would welcome Daniela Schwarzer for the second welcome tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Maike, a very warm thank you to you for hosting us and all of you tonight. It is fantastic that the amerikahaus is welcoming this event, because I think it's not only a topic which deserves a lot of attention, the long-term risks of climate change and the question of security related to it. It's also a moment where we are mostly focused on the immediate crises that endanger our security order, that occupy the minds of our leaders, and the short term very much drives a lot of the discussions today. And so I think it is great that we take this evening and look at the challenges that climate change and the prevention thereof pose to policymakers and societies, and that we discuss the related risks. I think that is one of probably the most important topics, in particular for the younger generation. For us as the Bertelsmann Foundation, it is hugely important to work with young leaders, with young thinkers, with activists who take their future in their hands and who can teach many of, let's say, the slower movers, in particular on this issue, that there's a huge sense of urgency and that we need to get together and do more than currently happening. For us, this event tonight, in a way, stands in a continuity of work not only with the next generation, not only on transatlantic relations, but also on the impact of climate change on many dimensions. And I wish to come back to an event which we hosted in 2022, the US-German Futures Forum, where we were already able to pick up topics that are crucially important for the next generation, democracy and technology, for instance, and global sustainability efforts and climate security. So I'm very glad you are all here. I'm really looking forward to the debate tonight, and I just wish to close with a note of thanks to Dr. Maike Zwingenberger, as I just mentioned, her hospitality here, the US Embassy in Berlin, who is a very good partner to our foundation on many occasions, the German Federal Foreign Office, with whom we also work very regularly, and my colleagues at the Bertelsmann Foundation. Many hands made this possible today. You will see Catherine on stage in a moment, and it's a great pleasure to see many of my colleagues here, and I hope you get to know each other. I now wish to pass the floor to Kate Guy, who is the Managing Director for Climate Security and Cross-Cutting Issues in the Office of the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the U.S. Department of State. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. Thank you to our fantastic hosts here at the Amerikahaus and the Bertelsmann Foundation for bringing us together. I'm so glad on behalf of the State Department to hear that for the rest of this weekend, Amerikahaus will be taken over as the headquarters of young people and rising leaders and youth who are here for the security conference, not just to participate on the side, but to really be part of it and be part of defining what is discussed here. And what better event to kick off that weekend than one focused on the security threat that this generation is most concerned with, and that will most define their futures as leaders, the climate crisis. At this point, we've known for many years that climate change will have direct and devastating impacts on our national and international security. It's not just young people who are telling this. Many people in this room have been responsible for defining the research and the policy behind this intersecting and emergent issue. And we have a more accurate intelligence picture than we ever had at the myriad pathways that security and stability will be completely upended, and frankly are being upended by climate-exacerbated shocks. You really only need to look at the viral images from a few weeks ago of rogue waves flooding US military sites in the Pacific to see viscerally what the future will look like, and that future is already here. That's why from day one of President Biden's term in office, we have mobilized to elevate and confront climate as the critical security threat that it is. And really, many of us in this room, Iris, myself, and others, were mobilizing even before day one of the administration to figure out what the game plan would be and how we would tackle this issue. And we have mobilized. Together, the Biden administration has released countless boundary-breaking new plans and strategies to address how climate shocks are unraveling the security of our world. From addressing growing water security and food insecurity, to hardening the resilience of our military and critical infrastructure, to projecting future threats in the polar regions or in the high seas or in space. All of these new security postures have climate change in mind and at the center of how we approach them. And I've seen this daily with our allies and partners who want to set up new dialogues and new efforts to approach these topics together diplomatically. But that's not enough, because we all understand that the security consequences magnify with each new tenth of degree of warming. So that's why President Biden and my boss, Special Envoy John Kerry, have also been laser focused on the central goal of confronting and mitigating the climate crisis overall. This has led to tireless efforts to rally the world to be more ambitious, to strengthen our commitments, and to meet our goals set under the Paris Agreement. And that's what we saw last December with a historic outcome at COP28 in Dubai. And that's what we'll keep pursuing towards each day and month ahead of us. And I think many of you know that Dubai was also the first time that we had a focus on security and resilience and peace at COP as well. So it was historic in that way too. But thankfully, we have in the White House a generational leader to hold us to this pace and hold us to this progress. And trust me, she does. Sarah Ladislaw, as we heard, is the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the White House. And Sarah is able to draw on her long career leading at the heart of climate and clean energy and energy security and overall security policy to serve as the President's nerve center across the administration, to pull together this 3D effort of defense, diplomatic, and development folks to lead a historic effort towards a better integration of climate security in our work. So please join me in welcoming Sarah and then the distinguished panel to follow her. I'm so excited to learn and hear from all of you. Thank you.
Her team and Iris and her team, both at the Department of Defense and Department of State, who do all of this great work that we're going to hopefully talk about and you'll hear about tonight on the issue of climate security. I can't help but mention on my way here, I was thinking about and reading up on the theme of the conference for the Munich Security Conference this year. And the theme is cooperating on shared challenges in a time of heightened geopolitical competition. And it kind of made me laugh because it sounded really familiar. And I was thinking about why it sounded familiar, and I realized It is almost literally the title of the US National Security Strategy intro to climate change. And I thought, well, that's very appropriate. That was nice of them to make this sort of an easy segue for me. But I mention it to suggest that this balance between competition and cooperation is going to be at the center of a whole lot of conversations we'll all be having this week. And it's not some surprising contradiction that sprung up in response to climate change, but instead, I'd like you to think about it as an animating feature of our approach. So to resolve this tension, the United States is attempting to harness the best and most productive outcomes of strategic competition and effective cooperation. The result is an effort to build up something we call mutually assured resilience, where by working together to enhance our respective and collective capabilities and capacities, we assure each other's resilience to the threats we face from a changing climate. Let me give you a couple of examples. We pursue this strategy in the context of building a new clean energy future. Under President Biden's leadership, which Kate just spoke about, the United States is pursuing a modern industrial and innovation strategy both at home and with partners abroad. It's a strategy that invests in the sources of our own economic and technological strength, promotes diversified and resilient global supply chains, and sets high standards for everything from labor and environment to trusted technologies and good governance, and deploys capital to deliver on public goods like climate and health. Thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest ever single clean energy act and investment action taken, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and other executive action, the United States is in a strong position to deliver on our 1.5-degree aligned target under the Paris Agreement. Through robust incentives, the U.S. will not only accelerate our own clean energy transition, but also catalyze investment in other countries and drop the cost of clean energy for everyone, potentially saving hundreds of billions of dollars globally. However, these investments and policies are only truly successful if they catalyze action by our partners and allies as well. As National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said, we unapologetically pursue our industrial strategy at home, but we are unambiguously committed to not leaving our friends behind. We want them to join us. In fact, we need them to join us. Ultimately, our goal is a strong, resilient, leading-edge techno-industrial base that the United States and like-minded partners, established and emerging economies alike, can invest in and rely on together. Mutual assured resilience. We take this approach to climate adaptation as well, because enhanced resilience for both communities, coupled with the stability of nations, while we're facing all of these climate challenges, is at the very heart of how we define climate security. Under President Biden's leadership, the United States government is working to implement a number of initiatives that Kate mentioned, but also to improve the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities at home and abroad to adapt to and manage increasing impacts of climate change across the globe. This type of climate resilient policy, enabled through initiatives like the President's Emergency Response for Adaptation and Resilience and the Famine Early Warning System, could reduce the number of people in need of international humanitarian assistance annually due to climate-related disasters to as low as 68 million by 2030 and drop further to 10 million by 2050, a decrease of 90% compared to 2021. But despite all of our best efforts and the progress we've made together, we are still struggling to keep pace with the global climate challenge. In 2022 alone, global climate weather and disasters resulted in economic losses of $313 billion, displacing people from their homes, destroying communities, and creating economic and social stressors. Without immediate global action during this crucial decade, global temperatures will cross the critical warming threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, after which scientists have warned some of the most catastrophic climate impacts could come to fruition. Even if all nations implemented their announced mitigation pledges, with emissions peaking by the mid-2020s, climate change will impact many facets of human life and every sector of society into the future. Globally, we still remain in a cycle of crisis response. But we have the tools and capabilities to move beyond this state. And there are a great many ideas out there, but I wanted to offer two for consideration. The first is to recognize that preparedness pays. As the impacts of long-term climate change continue to rise, investments in adaptation will have outsized benefits. Effective, inclusive investments in climate adaptation can minimize the impacts of climate change and, in some cases, even prevent them. Even $1 invested in climate adaptation yields between 2 to 10 in climate benefits. These benefits help avoid losses in lives and livelihoods, as well as lower financial costs, create meaningful jobs, contribute to greater security and stability, and strengthen capacity to protect hard-won development gains from being eroded by storms and droughts and rising sea levels and other climate impacts. For adaptation to decadal climate change, investments in protective infrastructure and improved climate-smart agriculture and infrastructure can yield 5 times higher return and prevent food loss. Additionally, studies have shown that $1 invested in resilient food systems can save up to 3 in acute crisis response funding. Provisional USG calculations find that early interventions in South Africa can alleviate anticipated El Niño-driven crop losses at the start of a growing season, such as use of heat-tolerant seeds, has up to 70% higher return than interventions made after the harvest, such as food aid. This year, climate finance is going to be a major issue for us to address in venues like the G20, the World Bank Evolution Process, the renewed UNFCCC climate finance commitments. In each of these conversations, we need to work together to ensure that adaptation and resilience measures are recognized by policymakers, international financial institutions, and investors as a critical element of creating a truly competitive and resilient economy. Through a combination of the right information, incentives, and policy structures, countries can create competitive and effective adaptation programs that can increase the flow of capital and resources at scale. It's an enormous opportunity, and we need to get it right. Second and finally, we should strive to even better integrate climate security into our foreign and national security policy making. I know this sounds obvious and somewhat trite coming from someone who just began by quoting the National Security Strategy and the linkage between it and climate change, but it oftentimes feels like when we in the climate community, climate security community, strive for comprehensiveness, where what policymakers need is clarity, prioritization, and just a simple mental model for compartmentalizing various challenges and solutions. An effort as simple as subdividing impacts into those with global reach, such as food shortages, disease vectors, or climate disaster-related disruptions to global supply chains, from regions that are susceptible to a variety of impacts that are likely to undermine regional stability and security, from building resilience and response measures to our most vulnerable nations. By subdividing our challenges in this way, we can better appreciate how they will manifest as fundamentally different kinds of foreign and national security policy challenges. It will also help us identify where building our respective preparedness and capacity to anticipate and deal with climate shocks yields those very important collective benefits, and allows us to prioritize areas of activity where that is most true. At the end of the day, our collective goal should be to deal with the changing climate regimes in ways that not only absorb the threats and stress, but simultaneously create resilience by improving the structure and function of our governance. With your support, we can and want to do everything we can to help mitigate the risks and support positive adaptation strategies through this concept of mutually assured resilience. Our efforts today will shape the world, along with you emerging leaders out there who will help us. And it will be an inheritance that will be measured not only by economic prosperity, but in health and resilience of our planet, and the multiple dividends of peace, security, and stability that we can reap together. Thanks very much.
Well, good evening, everyone, from my side as well. I'm Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook, Senior Advisor at the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Berlin and Gütersloh. I join in the chorus of saying thank you, because this is literally the second time that we've partnered with amerikahaus for the Munich Security Conference for an intergenerational, although gender Unitarian, conversation about climate security, which is actually my great pleasure, but I'll say something about that in just a second. But it truly always takes a team and an effort to put these kind of conversations together, and to most importantly, be in conversation with you. So again, to Dr. Maike Zwingenberger and her whole team, to our team at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and then to the very frequent partners of our weekly phone calls at the German Federal Foreign Office and our wonderful colleagues at the US Embassy, and then also the Consulate General here in Munich, an enormous debt of gratitude. We've heard sort of a theme setter here from Kate Guy and from Sarah Ladeslaw, and one thing that I picked up on precisely is that the sub-motto of the Munich Security Report, which you will have seen, is lose-lose. And I think this conversation this evening will be the most win-win, optimistic, how-to conversation you might hear all weekend. Because as all of our speakers, and including our opening speakers, have underscored, yes, the urgency is rife. The urgency is here. We feel it every single day in our own lives, but the opportunities to do things now, to tackle them together, and I adore this idea of mutually assured resilience. So the fact that all of us have a role to play, all of us in this room, and certainly in the transatlantic relationship, makes me fundamentally hopeful, and I'm sure we're going to hear just how we do that from these four women. To be fair, we did have a big run on this panel. David Miliband, the head of the IRC, International Rescue Committee, wanted very much to be here. He had to postpone his trip, and we allowed him only for gender balance reasons, of course. But I do want to recommend the new IRC report that's literally out just today, the Climate Action for the Epicenter of Crisis, well worth reading. So let me introduce my excellent panelists this evening to you and launch straight into this conversation. Iris Ferguson is all the way to our left. She's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience. Sarah was talking about where the critical issues are in clear geopolitics. The Arctic, I think as many of us are aware and have been aware for the better part of a decade and a half, is just one of those areas. And so I'm really pleased that you're here, Iris. She serves in this role as the Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Defense and Senior Leadership for Policy Matters pertaining to Arctic security and global resilience. And before that, she was Senior Advisor on Climate Security Issues in the Arctic for the U.S. Air Force Futures and the Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations Building. We just heard Kate point out how floods affect U.S. military installations. And again, this is a topic that, in terms of diplomacy, has external and internal negotiations ongoing. So, Iris, thank you for being here and sharing your perspective. To my nearest left is Katarina Kertusova. She's a climate security officer for Innovation Hybrid and the Innovation Hybrid and Cyber Division at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, part of the team responsible for the implementation of, do you want to show it off? Because it's right here. The Climate and Security Action Plan, adopted by NATO in 2021. And Katarina is an old hand in the transatlantic relationship, having worked, I think, for pretty much equidistantly for think tanks on both sides of the Atlantic. To my right is my former colleague from the German Council on Foreign Relations. I'm really pleased that Dr. Kira Finke is here. She's known to many now because she's written, well, if it's not a bestseller yet, it will sure be after this evening, a book, Sturmnomaden, which I recommend to all of you, that links precisely the sort of global effects of climate change to human security, to migration, to personal stories, and she's done it with incredible depth and attention to detail from her regional travels, from her years of research. Before she joined as the head of the Climate and Foreign Policy Center at the German Council on Foreign Relations, she was a research analyst and the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. She's advised in many senior roles the German government, with Janani about that. She's published in a lot of scientific and political journals in this area, including in Nature. And before joining Adelphi, Janani was the head of Environment, Climate Change, and Security at International Alert. So welcome, Janani. This is my favorite quote from the last year, absolutely gobsmackingly bananas. Those are not my words, clearly, but those of leading climate scientist Zeke Hausfather, who's based at the Berkeley Earth and Climate Data Project. And he was reflecting the climate data from just this past summer, from June through September, which made that period the hottest on record. Many of us will remember that. Many of us dwellers of cities will remember that and won't be surprised at the fact that over the last decade, the death rate from climate change-related deaths in cities, like Paris alone, went up 400%. And that is in the developed world, which we know well, and we referenced the floods in California. We referenced what seems like freak weather environments, but as it is with global inequality, it always strikes where the weakest are the most vulnerable. And then if we look at these kind of heat statistics, the Sahel, as Kira focuses on, heats up or is hotter by 50% over the kind of climate developments we have seen. So when inequality strikes, it strikes harder for those who are the most vulnerable. And when we see a border crisis at the American southern border, which has become the substance of so much political infighting in the United States, so many of those refugees are now people that are arriving all the way from Afghanistan, the victims of a conflict that we as the transatlantic community did not deal with as well, but is now exacerbated by extreme climate phenomena in Afghanistan and are forcing people to move, creating different kinds of questions in terms of our borders, the permissibility of our migration policy, and fundamentally, the resilience of our society. So you see, we have a big panoply of things to talk about. Sarah and Kate set us up so well. So let's get straight to it. I want to ask all four of you, starting with Iris. We've just mapped, and the biggest thing I think in this area is, of course, everything is happening everywhere, all at once, to speak with a recent Oscar winner. So in the priorities that Sarah mentioned and how the American government is trying to keep both the domestic challenges on the climate change front and the international challenges pressuring through strategic competition, allies, foes, partners into action, what is the greatest priority we should be focusing on? How should we sequence this action, Iris?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, and thanks for hosting this really wonderful panel and discussion, and can't agree more with Kate and saying this is a wonderful way to tee off the weekend and some of the really great conversations that you all will hear over the next couple of days. We heard from both Kate and Sarah the importance of our interagency perspective of the 3 Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development, and I think all 3 of those are really critical for us to lean into in order to solve this challenge. And I'm here to tell a little bit about the defense side of that story, about the role of the Department of Defense, and how we're thinking about navigating the climate crisis as one of the world's largest organizations. People often forget how large we are, that we have little mini cities across the world, and we have lots of operations globally, of course. You hear frequently from our secretary the statement that climate change is impacting us at the strategic, the operational, and the tactical levels. And I think if you're talking about different frameworks in order to kind of help subdivide how we take action, that's how we're sort of thinking about it within the Department of Defense. But just to explain what that means in practice and what that change feels like for us. At the strategic level, it's changing the way we operate and where we operate. The Arctic is a great example of that. It's warming at some 3 times the rate of the rest of the world. We're seeing increased human activity, including by our competitors, and we're doing some deep analysis of what we actually need to operate there and what kind of things we need for our own defense and to detect threats. It's also impacting our allies and partners in a really significant way, whether it be drought impacting in North Africa or sea level rise in the Pacific Islands. This has real implications for our strategic objectives and our partnerships across the globe, because many of our partners are declaring climate change as their #1 national security threat. And not only that, their militaries are often those that are the first on the line and the first responders. So we're really looking at how we can build the resilience and capacity of our partners alongside our interagency partners as well, to be able to help them to respond to increasing threats. And let it not be forgotten that there's a competition element to that as well, because if we're not responding and helping our partners develop their own resilience and capacity, then our strategic competitors are. From an operational lens, it's impacting us because we're seeing increased missions and requirements for us to respond, especially for extreme weather events. The military is not the first responders for us in our country. That's our local law enforcement, but we are often called in when it's overwhelming for our law enforcement, which is becoming increasingly frequent. Our National Guard, who is across the United States, has at least half of the National Guard, which is about 450,000 soldiers, have responded to natural disasters in 2022. That's a remarkable statistic to say that over half of the time that our National Guard is spending responding to national disasters. Really incredible. It's also impacting our installations and impacting our ability to operate from our installations to project power, but also to do the mission that the bases require. Tyndall Air Force Base was hit by a huge hurricane just a couple of years ago, devastating, multi-billion-dollar devastation that impacted a whole fighter squadron. Kate mentioned just a couple of weeks ago rogue waves impacting a really critical missile defense site in the Pacific Islands for us. These are things that we have recognized as a challenge and maybe thought, oh, this will happen in the future, but it's happening now. And we are reeling with how to predict better and to try to get after building our own resilience of our base infrastructure. And then lastly, the tactical level, we're seeing a real, an impact from equipment and on platforms. So for equipment, we're doing a lot of thinking about what types and new types of equipment we might need. Say for the Arctic, do you need different types of cold weather gear if you're operating in the North American Arctic or the European Arctic, which quite frankly have different environments to them. For platforms, we're seeing that rising temperatures have real implications for our ability to operate. Our submarines are impacted by increasing and changing salinity, and their sonars don't work the same. For our C-17s, which are our huge cargo aircraft that we rely on to transport goods all over the world, we're seeing studies that say in 2030 that the heat that we will have to operate in will impact our lift capacity by 8%. And that's a lot, actually, to say that we will be able to have less people, less goods on our airplane because our planes won't be able to hold so much because of the heat. So we're doing a lot of deep thinking about how these changes at the strategic and the operational and tactical level impact us, and just briefly on to what we're doing about those issues. One, we're being deliberate in our planning. We've talked about the National Defense Strategy, as you all have heard, but that's a real critical document for us in the Department of Defense in terms of planning, in terms of setting prioritizations. I think the Department of Defense is probably the most reliant on strategic documents of any organization in the world, primarily somewhat because we are so big and that you have to have things on paper to really declare what are your clear priorities. But responding to the climate crisis is within and throughout that document. We're investing in analysis of platforms and investing a lot in war games, and happy to talk a little bit more about this in detail in the Q&A. We're also looking at making ourselves more resilient and more efficient. We have to build our installations with greater resiliency. We're working on ensuring that our energy is also resilient and investing in microgrids. Our Army is trying to have a microgrid at every installation by 2035. And we are leaning into innovation where we can grab efficiencies for fuel. As we were talking backstage, that there's a huge liability for fuel for us. It's expensive. It's also really heavy. It's also an area of attack for our competitors, whether that be in Afghanistan, as we saw in many of our operations where fuel convoys were attacked, and we dealt with far too many casualties due to attacks on fuel convoys, or we're looking to the Pacific where there's long lead times and our fuel supply and distribution is the point of attack for adversaries when we game out hypothetical scenarios there. There's real need for us to build efficient platforms and to lean into efficiency, not only because it's the right thing for us to reduce our emissions footprint, but because it has real operational advantage for us. And so we're investing in big platforms like a blended wing body aircraft, which is like a man array on wings that would basically increase efficiency by some 30%. That's game-changing technology that has implications not only for us, but also for the potential civilian world. And then also, lastly, working with partners in the interagency and to try to build that resilience. We have a program in my office called Defense Operational Resilience International Cooperation Program, which is trying to help, for the first time, build the capacity of military and security forces. It's the only authority that we have in the US government to try to help build capacity of military and security forces around adapting to climate resilience issues. So we're leaning into that in its second year and really working on interoperability issues with NATO partners as we navigate the energy transition. That's one thing that I haven't really talked about, but I look forward to diving into a little bit more, that there is so much happening in the commercial sector and so much emphasis that's being placed on our own commercial advantages that we can have within the energy from the energy transition from the IRA that happened, that we need to be leveraging that within the defense industry, and we need to be working with our NATO partners for battery standardization, for sustainable aviation fuel requirements, all of the above. And there's really so much that is happening in the DoD. If you can't tell, really looking forward to unpacking it further.
Thank you, Iris. We have been talking nonstop, I think, in European security circles, and I'm sure in Brussels this past week, about how we fix some of the procurement issues we have, some of the sort of blatant interoperability issues we have with an eye to securing Ukraine. And you would think that in those conversations, the things that Iris have pointed out is how do we make that sustainable? How do we build and create fleets that will not only allow us to do continuous maintenance, put them back into the field, but put them into the field of battle and into a deterrence space in a more efficient, effective way that's based in sustainability principles, that's based in lean footprint structures, that's based into these functionality and interoperability things or sort of guidelines. At NATO, where you're trying to bridge some of the cutting edge work that's going on in a number of the NATO member states, but then try to create ideally a ceiling, but maybe let's say first a floor with respect to climate response and operations, but then also new theaters. NATO has been really focused, laser focused on what's happening in the Arctic, in part because, as many of you know, the institutional bodies that address the Arctic directly, the Arctic Council, doesn't have the kind of security muscle that future questions in the Arctic might need. So, same question to you, Katarina. In this plethora of challenges, how do you think about priorities at NATO?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Climate and Energy Security section at NATO. So I'd start by saying that NATO is a multinational political military alliance. So the prism through which we look at and assess the challenges associated with the changing climate is very much rooted and defined by a core purpose, which is to ensure collective defense of our 31, soon to be 32 members against all threats from all directions. And so this is our key purpose, and our ability to do so is very much affected by a changing climate. There's no part of national security that does not intersect in one way or another with the ravages of a changing climate. So every threat we are looking at and that we're trying to address is being multiplied by a changing climate. And this is why NATO will be in the room for these discussions. While we have been focusing on environmental challenges for over 50 years now, it wasn't really until 3-4 years ago, until 2021, when there was agreement that this should be a NATO issue, when the consensus was reached, because we work by consensus. So in 2021, NATO has set itself the ambition to become the leading international organization when it comes to understanding and adapting to the impacts of climate change on security. And we have also adopted, or heads of states and governments have adopted, a climate change and security action plan, which really defines the role we want to carve out for ourselves. And this role is spread across four pillars. First, we try to help our member states better understand what changing climate means for their security and for how their armed forces operate. Second, we help them adapt to the changing climate. Third, mitigate, so looking at ways in which we can help our member states reduce their military emissions. And finally, enhancing outreach, so recognizing that this is a cross-border issue that no single institution can address on its own, and we work with other international and regional organizations. We work with the private sector. We work with academia and other think tanks. In doing that, we recognize that NATO is not a first responder to every challenge created by a changing climate, that we have a very unique value added. And if I may, maybe I'll just touch upon some of the elements where we could add value. The first one is that we are really a unique platform where member states come together on a daily basis to discuss energy and climate-related developments and ways in which they impact our security. So this is very important for the exchange of best practice and for learning. Second, we have over 40 partners around the world, and this network of partners is very helpful for both capacity and resilience building, but again, for learning from one another. As Iris has mentioned, we have a very good track record as a standard setter. So NATO can set standards not only on what equipment our member states use, but also how we operate. And we also have a lot of normative influence. So what we do is observed elsewhere and emulated. And our militaries, and this is not NATO specific, but it applies to all of our members, we have a tremendous buying power, and we have historically been able to move certain markets. So we can scale up some of the innovative low-carbon solutions, but also create demand signal for the industry to invest in developing new ones. But in everything that we do, we recognize that maintaining military effectiveness, interoperability, and credible deterrence and defense posture is a priority, because we have a job to do, and that is to ensure security in the Euro-Atlantic space.
So we'll probe that a little bit more in terms of how you get to these kind of goals when we look at the deterrence needs that we now have, which are so heightened for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in a way, you know, that Madrid really pinned that needle, and certainly Washington for the 75th anniversary summit this summer will as well. So we'll look forward to hearing a few more details there. Kira, you look at this from a human security perspective, from the populations who are most affected, where the vulnerabilities are so exacerbated and have become so accelerated, frankly, that these plans might seem very far away from the kind of realities that the people that you think about are affected by day. When you think about priorities, priority actions that need to be taken with your focus, what's first of mind?
I mean, in the end, this interlinks somehow, right? Because the implications of what was just outlined have real-world impacts. If I think of priorities, and of course I had a bit more time now to think about it since you asked my two colleagues here first, I think of mitigation, adaptation, mediation, and migration, and also in this order. And I will briefly explain why. So mitigation, because the rate of change we are witnessing from climate change is outpacing our rate of adaptation. Mm-hmm. So we will never be able to save as many lives through any sort of adaptation than we are able to save through prevention, through mitigation, emissions mitigation. And I think we are very, very far away from the temperature limits that we have set in the Paris Agreement, in the sense that we are not on track. We are still increasing our global emissions. They are not falling, they should be falling. And this is increasing our risks every day. Mm-hmm. And this means that also every conflict that is happening, for whatever reason it is happening, geopolitical or economic reason, is happening already in a changing climate, because we already hit 1.5 degrees increase last year. It may not stay for several years, it may go down again a little bit in the annual mean temperature, but we will go beyond 1.5 degrees, and this will have devastating impacts, for example, for small island states in the Central Pacific. And on the other side of this is, of course, the question of energy security in the green transformation. And I think we also need to frame this much more as a security issue. This has become very much apparent through the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And we should look at, for example, on the European side, Baltic offshore wind as a project of security. Mm-hmm. Not only as a project of energy supply, but as a project of European security and regional integration. Going from the mitigation angle to the adaptation angle, when mitigation fails, and it has, in my view, mostly failed, because we are witnessing now the impacts of climate change. 2023 was an example of that. Droughts, floods, storms, wildfires. Even industrialized countries, we have many deaths from these types of events now, even countries where you have the financial and technological means. And so you really need to ramp up at different levels of governance the adaptive capacities. And of course, we have many people, especially located around the tropical belt, that have very little financial or technological means to adapt. Mediation, I think of in particular environmental peace building, a method that looks at the common governance of ecosystems as a tool for creating sustainable peace. It can be reforestation, it can be using certain agricultural lands as a common good and preserving their use for coming generations. And this can also bring people together again that have fought over these resources. But it needs some, often it needs some sort of guidance, it needs some funding also, especially if you're trying to restore certain ecosystems, you need some time for them to recover. And in this time, people will have to resort to other means to support themselves in this time. And the last thing I mentioned is migration. Which is an issue that we have to really change the narrative on, because in a changing climate, we will have more and more areas that will become less habitable or uninhabitable, meaning that the carrying capacity for certain amounts of population will be reduced, or even especially in the more extreme climate change scenarios, again, the more we mitigate, the less this will occur. But in the more extreme climate change scenarios, we will have areas that will become uninhabitable. And this is not only in low-lying small island states, but also in areas that are too hot and too humid for people to survive outside. And then you have very strong pressures on habitability.
Janani, all of this, exactly what Kira described, will take an enormous amount of trade-offs, and I want to lean in specifically to the point that she made about mediation. Because as you tell us where you see your priorities, you also study how you move people along to understanding these trade-offs and what that kind of diplomacy looks like. So if you would share where you see the priorities, and maybe just to pivot off of what Kira said on the mediation point, maybe the greatest opportunities, but possibly also the challenges that you see in your practice.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks so much to the organisers for being here. It's so great to start the MSc with such an important conversation. Yeah, thanks, Kira. That was an excellent taxonomy, and I really like the 4 points. But I think, as you alluded to, and Sarah also alluded to in her keynote, yes, we need to mitigate, but even if we mitigated right now, even if we cut global emissions to zero right now, the emissions in the system right now mean that the impacts are going to play out for the next few decades. And so we really, really need to be thinking within the climate security space about how to address these risks now. And I think we often in this space talk about climate and security or climate change as being a threat multiplier, and I'd urge us to go beyond this language and think, if we want to really prioritize what we can do now to prevent these risks playing out in the future, to move beyond thinking of this as a threat multiplier, to really think about context-dependent pathways through which climate impacts the drivers of conflict, how it poses specific obstacles to peace, and to whom, whose risks are we talking about? My research has shown how climate impacts are diminishing livelihoods of young people, men and women, in northern Mozambique at the moment, and this is creating more incentives for them to join armed opposition groups. Climate is impacting or fueling ungovernable migration from rural areas to urban centers in Haiti at the moment, which is compounding the existing instability that is is kind of already incredibly difficult to find a route into. We're seeing climate impacting the compounding of the scarcity of natural resources and increased competition and conflict over natural resources in Colombia, which is particularly affecting communities who are dependent on forests for their livelihoods. So when we have this understanding of these specific pathways, rather than seeing climate change as this amorphous or ambiguous risk that multiplies all these threats, it really helps us identify the specific entry points and the target actors, which help us prioritize action and financing and really make those directions. And this means we need to really have a robust understanding of what these risks look like at the most granular level possible. And that means we really need the right kind of assessment, not at 30,000 feet, but at the most localized level possible. And this calls for kind of working across silos. I think about climate security as being a puzzle, and the pieces to the puzzle lie across all of the sectors, across the 3Ds, across development, diplomacy, defense, but across a bunch of other sectors too. And we really need to get better. We know this, but we need to get better at having these kind of intersectoral capacities to join the dots, put all the puzzle pieces together to see what those risks are, to be able to prioritize. And you mentioned sequencing as well, Sarah, Catherine, and I think this is a real issue as well. I spend a lot of time, it's almost like a daily battle with, that I face with policymakers, that there's this idea that there's this linear sequence to actions. First we establish peace, and then we think about climate change. I was dealing with people, this was about a decade ago, but people working on the peace and political settlements in Afghanistan, and they literally said to me, first we do peace, then you can come back and count butterflies. First we do peace, then we do climate change. First we deal with short-term humanitarian need, and then we will think about the longer-term climate implications of those humanitarian actions. And, I'm sure, Kira, you've touched on this in your fieldwork as well, but we can see that this is, of course, nonsensical. We've seen how climate-blind stabilization efforts in the Lake Chad region is actually fueling, it's causing farmers to join Boko Haram because they're so angry because the military is going in and raising their crops to the ground. It's diminishing their climate resilience. We're seeing how, I saw firsthand devastatingly how in northeastern Nigeria, emergency food aid was delivered to fend off the impending famine in 2017. Effectively, sure, they fend off, the famine was kind of pushed away, but the food aid was delivered without fuel. And this, of course, led to widespread deforestation as people went looking for fuel wood, so we're deforesting to cook the food. And this then, when so it was humanitarian aid that wasn't thinking about climate impacts, it wasn't looking at kind of long-term climate resilience and the environmental piece. And then when the rains came, the camps were inundated. When the dry season came, dust storms actually then, annihilated the crops. People had kitchen gardens and small holdings and small kind of animals, and this was all decimated by the floods and the dust storms. So the very short-term climate-blind interventions actually then remove people's long-term stability, and actually that camp was no longer viable. So I think we have to break this sequencing myth.
I think this is a really interesting point because so much of what we try to do in an intergenerational conversation is this idea of a new approach to learning and where we learn, right? And transforming so many of our established organizations into learning organizations. And I think, that in so many ways I feel that was the impulse of COP, but now all of you have likely been to COP, and talk about non-sequence conversations, it's very hard to track any kind of linearity there. And to your point about Colombia, so much of the resilience building in recovering from effectively a drug-violent country had been to reintroduce the idea of peace into a resilience component, but to set community members back into their communities on an environmental path. But that, to figure out how you then scale and bring that into sequence into something that's comparable, is unbelievably difficult. Kira, from your work, when you look at this idea of sequencing, I said glibly this idea of everything everywhere all at once. How do you, in your conversations with policymakers, in your conversations with established multilateral, multinational organizations, how do you try to hold the feet to the fire to see these interconnections?
I mean, the upside of the tragedy that we are witnessing is that climate change is becoming so apparent that we are seeing the impacts everywhere, that people are aware that it is affecting livelihoods all across the globe. And one risk that we are running is that we are having more of these synchronous events. So a flood in one part of the world, a massive drought in another part of the world, a wildfire in the third part of the world, all happening at the same time. And this, of course, overstretches often our capacities to react and also to provide humanitarian assistance, etc. And then mistakes happen as you have laid out. How do you then prioritize? I mean, of course, this one question is that of need. And then on how to also reach most vulnerable groups within those affected areas. And this is not often, not so straightforward, because as we saw, for example, in Germany in the Ahrtal floods, there was several people who have died in a disability home because there was no evacuation plan for them, and they could not self-evacuate and eventually drowned in these flooding events. So to identify the most vulnerable populations, this can be, for example, people with disability, but it can also be children, women, and this extends also to the periods after the event.
Right.
So when I was doing some research in Bangladesh, we saw the effects of tropical cyclones persisting over years, also in the Caribbean, persisting over years, the destruction still being apparent. The soil is still salinized because the storm surges were, of course, salt water, and then you have salinized soil, and then you cannot grow rice there, for example, right? So, and then you have these difficult situations that really inhibit human development for many, many years to come. And this is not really so easy to measure, but when you are talking to people, you are understanding how interconnected these issues are. And then one other aspect is this question of multiple shocks, and I think this is what you somehow also talked about, is that you have not only one climate event, but you now have more frequent climatic events, and then you have households who are, of course, also affected by other events, for example, a death in the family, or a sickness, or an economic crisis, etc. So you have these multiple shocks that are happening at different points in time and that are eroding resilience over time, so that when another climatic event comes, the resilience is already eroded, and then people cannot respond as they could have before.
It gets me back to what both of you mentioned, Iris and Katerina, coming into it. It's this idea of forecasting and ring fencing, to think about how far do our responsibilities extend and how do we get beyond this. So what Kira was just saying reminded me also, of course, climate change or climate effects as ways of hybrid warfare. So if we think about the Kerch Dam being blown up, and the effects that that had on a Ukrainian population that was already deeply vulnerable and deeply in conflict. Iris talked about red team, blue team. Those are the old school forecasting exercises at the Pentagon. Now I'm sure much more complex, technology supported. But at NATO, Katerina, when you think about trying to forecast this sort of cascade of effects that Janani and Kira have both mapped out, how do you do that? What tools are you using? And then where do you, quote unquote, stop as NATO? Where do you ring fence? At what point do you say, well, we can see this coming, but this is not NATO's challenge to deal with?
I'd start by saying that NATO today has to face direct and indirect threats at the same time. And I'd say we, have a good handle on the direct ones, on our assets and installation, and it's something we've been adapting to for decades. But it's really the indirect impacts, the second and third order impacts, understanding how populations will respond in different parts of the world, what that could mean for our security inside and in our neighborhood. That's an area where we have some ground to make up. I think on the whole, there are different parts of the house that work on better understanding and better forecasting. We are developing a prototype climate change and security risk management tool, which will help member states and our partners better understand future operating environments. We are also trying to leverage in-house scientific work. So we have science and technology ecosystem that has been working on better understanding environmental risks at NATO. We have strategic foresight work happening both in the military and the civilian side of the house. So there is an ongoing effort to improve our ability to forecast. It's an ambition. It's work in progress, and we won't have the answers from one day to another, but it's something we're investing in. It's something we understand needs strengthening.
We're about to come to your questions, and we have about 20 minutes of them, and I can see a number of very senior experts in this audience, but I have about 7 more questions that I could be asking, but it's really your conversation to be having. So I'm going to pose one last question to Iris, and then as your hands shoot up, you'll get to pose your question, make a brief comment if it's brief, and make sure that whatever you say ends with a question mark and your voice going up at the end. We'll have roving microphones, so just to get your creative juices flowing. Iris, on this precise component of, because now we've talked about all the sort of integrated difficulties you have on the forecasting side, on the responsibility side, because you mentioned the 3D nexus as well, and that came up in Sarah's comments. Take us a little bit more into that idea where, you know, let's say it gets wrong, it goes wrong in the forecasting, it goes wrong. How has the Pentagon, in working with some of the civilian parts of the infrastructure, the 3Ds that you mentioned, worked on the mitigation of the wrong diagnostics? And what kind of tools, technology, whatever the case, are you using to get the forecasting more correct?
Yeah, no, it's a actually super tricky question. It's an easy question to pose, but quite frankly, very tricky to unravel about what right looks like for forecasting. And just to dovetail a little bit off of what Katarina said, you know, we do a lot of our internal work around our installations and looking at vulnerabilities of our own installations. We've been doing so much work over the past 10 years in particular about seeing where there's potential for increased flooding or increased sea level rise or increased wildfires that could impact training ranges. There's a lot more that we can do from an investment and resilience perspective, but it's this second and third order effect that I think is really tricky to map and to navigate, and especially for our combatant commands who are, combatant command is basically how we divide up the world. Our geographic combatant commands, for those that aren't familiar, are North America and Europe and South America and the Indo-Pacific and CENTCOM, and they are charged with looking at challenges within their theater and trying to ensure that their troops are postured for potential instability. And the climate challenge is a really tricky one to forecast. Like, what are the drivers? What could cause instability? What could cause increased migration that might have impact to bleed into conflict? We've been really trying over the past several years. We've embarked on a big wargaming apparatus for the DoD, and we've included our interagency partners in these games because it's a really important component of it. We have war games that are taking place in every combatant command, but it's a learning journey on how those war games get structured and how they're meaningful. It's not always self-apparent on how you would do a war game to get after, to be able to tee up a decision, for example, of how does that impact where we decide to put a base, or would that impact what kind of training our troops would need, or does that mean that we need to give different tools to our partners? It's probably all of the above, and then what scenarios do you use, which projections are you using, which science are you using to back up the projections, is a really tricky problem set that is I think, still being worked out, quite frankly, especially within our own interagency process. But we are really heavily focused over the next year in involving the interagency as a piece of this, because as we've talked about before, defense is only one part of the challenge and only one responder, quite frankly, and defense doesn't necessarily want to be called upon to respond to some of these challenges and disasters. The more that we can rely on our diplomatic efforts for mitigation or our development work for increasing resilience of our partners, the better off we are from a defense perspective. So really leaning in to the interagency over the next year in particular. And I just a couple of, I think, important tangibles on the limitations, I think, around tools right now. I think there's been quite a bit of work in forecasting around 10 years and beyond, but really our decision makers are making decisions between now and 5 years, 5 years and 10 years. And this sub-decadal science is challenged right now. So we're really leaning on our science community in the US to try to help us unpack that sub-decadal potential for different crises that might come along. That, and I think technology is moving so fast in the commercial sector too, and we need to figure out how we're leveraging the tools that the commercial sector provides, to include from space and different projection capabilities that might exist. So there's a lot I think that we could unpack around tools and how we're using those as policymakers and how we could do that work collectively. I think the NATO Center of Excellence for Climate Security, and notionally that would be a great mandate for them to take on as they stand up in Canada, and I know that you all are doing a lot of work too, but there's a lot of job potential for the future in this space. So,
well, what I'm hearing in some of the subtext here is that we'll need so much more climate intelligence to get ahead of some of the questions that we're backward mapping. And again, I think it's, to keep it in diplomacy speak, is to change not only who's at the table, but change the shape of the table. And of course, that's what we've been trying to do at COP, for better or worse. And we'll drill into that maybe as part of our questions. So we have about 20 minutes. I'm seeing the hands shoot up. That's my favorite sort of questioning phase. So we'll go over here in the back. Please introduce yourself and make sure your question ends in a question mark.
Yeah, hello, my name is Leo. I'm a bioinformatician. Thank you very much for the multifaceted information you're giving us. I wondered in this conversation, it's a lot about defense and strategic positioning and fighting future enemies, kind of in the sense of climate change. Is the NATO or Pentagon also investigating what kind of measures can be taken to stabilize the whole system? So, for example, something like peatland restoration.
Okay, that's great. Should we take a second question? Do I see something? It's very dark over here. Okay, yes, right there in the middle. We'll take two at a time. Go ahead.
Well, a very good evening to all of you. My name is Mehtab Singh, and I just arrived from Slovenia just for this panel. My question is that since we are talking about the climate change and its impacts, couple of smaller islands or small islands are sadly bound to drown in the couple of probably decades. For example, Maldives is going to be underwater, about 80% underwater in the couple of, let's say in 2050. Those are actually the statistics. Are there any measures taken by the concerned people that if there is any evacuation policy that just in case that happens, are you talking to the nearby countries or anybody around that just in case that happens so that those people do not just die or have no space to live? So are there any policies by the US government or the people who are concerned that there are some policies that they could be airlifted or they could be moved before that actually disaster happens? Thank you.
Okay, so how concrete are we in mitigating things that we can already see in the very distant future? Do you both want to respond to our first question?
Yeah, I'm sure. Just to clarify, the question was around like land restoration. Is that what is that?
It was in general, what kind of analysis are you doing to assess what kind of measures you can take to prevent climate change?
Way before.
Okay. Yeah. So I think in terms of stabilizing the system and looking, I mean, that's a tricky one, and what the defense mission is in that space. You know, I think we really are leaning a lot on our interagency partners to help map what our type of systems approach looks like. I will say from a defense perspective, we look at ecosystems as part of the fundamental calculus and what we need and how we need to build resilience, especially for our services, our Army, Navy, and Air Force. They all have installations that are in huge tracts of land, and that land is a part of an ecosystem. And so how they can manage fire resistance by different types of ecosystem management is a huge topic of conversation right now, looking at how we can use our land actually as a carbon sink in a lot of ways. Can we plant more trees on the existing space that we have to do our own to reduce our level of emissions? And just looking broadly at how we're doing coastal management. There's a lot of sea level and storm surge that impacts our naval bases, so looking at how we're able to help build reef structures that help build our own resilience. We do think about things from that perspective all the time, and it's happening at a very localized level.
Katarina. And maybe I'll just touch upon, the question was also about peatlands. So maybe in general, nature-based solutions are part of the answers. At NATO specifically, on an annual basis, we produce compendium of best practice, and it's essentially a document that maps out different climate awareness, adaptation, and mitigation measures that have been put in place NATO-wide, and that could help us address the problem. Back to nature-based solutions, a net zero future doesn't mean that we will not be operating some of the equipment. It means that we can take out some carbon, and it could be also by better management of the land and of the forest, also the military owns. So it is part of the solution.
On the second question, Kira and Janani, this idea that, I mean, those are things that we very clearly see coming.
Yeah, I mean, the situations are very heterogeneous, right? So, for example, some Pacific small island states are under compact of free association with the United States, so people are able to live and work in the United States. This is regardless of the climate change, so to say. Then again, others do not have this setup. For example, there's a new treaty that has emerged between Tuvalu and Australia, right. Where there is at least an agreement that as climate change intensifies, more people from Tuvalu can move to Australia, yeah. And in a sort of labor migration scheme. And this, of course, also has a geopolitical dimension. So there are some movements, but in the end, the question is not wholly resolved. The issue is not wholly resolved. There's not a plan for everybody, and also people who are moving in the context of climate change often fall in a sort of protection gap. If they're moving internally, they are often moving in contexts where the so-called guiding principles on internal displacements are not fully implemented. These are non-binding principles. And if they're moving across borders, they do not fall, or many of them do not fall under the Geneva Convention, because they are not persecuted, which is the defining variable for refugee status under this convention. So there is a significant protection gap, and in the end, it's not answered what happens in an extreme case. Of course, there's also some sort of often in many cases some regional arrangements where countries have obliged themselves to help if need arises. What I also want to mention to the first question, just very briefly, if I think about climate security, I always think about how to deal with very concrete climate impacts. So this was more how our conversation was directed at. So how does one population deal with a certain storm, and then how do they recover and not fall into some sort of state of conflict? But the other dimension of climate security is how do we keep Earth a safe operating space for humanity? And this then has the climatic dimension. This has the biodiversity dimension, the so-called also the planetary boundaries framework, where also other pollutants besides greenhouse gases play a role, for example, fertilizers or how are we dealing with our freshwater resources. And I think, of course, this then falls into various other institutional frameworks. But I think it is important that also those agencies that have to provide for our safety have a sort of bird's eye view of where we stand. For example, when it comes to risks of tipping cascades or tipping elements in the Earth system, for example, the Gulf Stream system that may be at risk of tipping in the future. And so I think to conceptualize this around these two elements, I think is very fruitful when we think about climate security.
Janani, just on this last part, the degree to which we can get ahead of what's to come. I mean, do you see in the conversations that you follow so closely, do you see some of that beyond, well, it's a lateral to the 30,000 foot piece, happening in the way that's being suggested?
Yes, but as Kira said, it's really heterogeneous and it's also really nuanced. And I think it's important when we think about some of these risks to not go with kind of received wisdom or these perception-based or kind of the headline narratives. And yes, absolutely, territorial integrity and the loss of life in facing small island states that are at risk of being inundated is a huge, huge risk. But we did some research in the Pacific looking with fieldwork in Tuvalu, in Kiribati, and in the Royal Marshall Islands. And that is there. It's a looming risk, but if we think about the time frame that Iris mentioned, this kind of immediate 3 to 5 year time frame, the risks are actually rather different. There are communities here facing hunger because actually there's droughts on these islands. They're just not able to feed their population, and there's a lot of livelihood stress, and then what we're seeing is an increase in domestic violence. So there's huge challenges and intergenerational conflicts. And then if we look at the Maldives, there's actually a huge challenge around radicalization. So we think about small islands, disappearing islands, and this kind of the risk of migration, but unless we go in and really understand some of these dynamics, we will miss some of the other dynamics of human security being put at risk by climate change. And I think that's very important. On the second point, I think it was touched on by all the speakers. I think the one way of looking at climate security is how to address these risks now. The other is the planetary dimension. And yes, it does call for this interagency, very holistic approach to looking at it. And it's not going to be the case that NATO and defense departments have the solutions to prevent the risks that they're facing. So a lot of these responses will lie outside of the security community. So a lot of these responses, like land restoration, nature-based solutions, these are phase 0 interventions. They come way upstream to prevent the risks that we're facing, but they're going to lie within the mandates of other institutions. So we do need a lot more kind of cross-sectoral engagement. If we're thinking about a better way of working for the UN system, the UNFCCC doesn't have a mandate for peace and security. The UN Security Council is grappling with it. There was just a debate, was it yesterday? 2 days ago, in the Council again on climate, and yet again we have the same conversations about this doesn't belong in the Security Council, it belongs elsewhere. And so I think it's about kind of breaking down some of these silos to ensure that the responses to the problems can be preventative. But that means being able to kind of have these mixed mandates crossing different agencies.
Well, we have to turn that into an opportunity, because I promised this audience that this was going to be an opportunity and solution-based piece. So if you want to work on the gnarly point about systems change and who's listening to whom at what time, then Janani will be happy to hear your ideas. Okay, next round of questions. Oh my gosh, okay, wow, all right. How are we gonna do this? Let's go right here in the middle. I have this sort of cluster right here in the middle of 3 questions that are sort of all together here. Marcos, can you see these? Yeah, 2 women and a male colleague. Okay, let's see if we can.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate this very productive conversation about climate change. I'm Allison, I'm 17, and I really do care about this, and I think that climate change is top of mind for a lot of the younger generation. Going on the theme of emerging leaders and young leaders, you've stated that building climate intelligence will be a critical component of addressing right now the direct implications of climate change. What sort of positive, optimistic framework would you suggest for young leaders to adopt to make this an optimistic win-win situation?
I like that very much. Allison, right behind you is, yes.
Hi, my name is Eva Garofano. I'm 18 years old, and I'm here with Allison as a member of the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange Program. And as young people, I think we often look at big corporations polluting the environment and islands sinking, and we feel very powerless to stop this. And we can also look at individuals like yourselves with influential international offices and feel, at least for now, very far removed from these positions. So my question kind of complements Allison, and it is, what role do you see the contributions of everyday individuals having in the future of climate change, and what can we do to maximize our impact?
Leave it to the next generation to ask the hardest questions to answer. That's great. And then right over, there was a gentleman to the, there you go. Yes, you.
My name is Winrich Rauschning. I'm a citizen living close to Munich. I'm in retirement age. Since you are all from a military defense background, I have enjoyed living in a relatively secure period, and there have been arms treaties, and these were based on trust. So since you are all, and we are all living in the same boat concerning the climate, so what can the environmental community learn from you as defense or arms treaty specialists to make more sustainable agreements?
Oh, great questions. Okay, we'll take this round. I'm already getting the time signal over here because we do have a reception waiting for you. So I have promises from our panelists that they will not run away and be with you for at least a glass of wine, so you can needle them with additional questions. But I think that was a really excellent crop. I love this idea. How can environmental activists at every level, when you're working on contractual obligation, I think that's a fundamental question of COP, really, learn from other ways in which we have built trust, resilience. We talked about mutually assured resilience, learn from other systems and ways before. Janani.
Oh, gosh, I start, okay. I think, also just tracking how the climate conversation has moved over the decades, I think what we can learn is that we won't get there through kind of goodwill and the moral argument. I think what we can learn is that we need a hard-nosed business case. We need to show that this is value for money, that if we don't address climate risks whilst we're investing in defense equipment, whilst we're kind of investing in long-term infrastructure, these are poor investments. We need to show that through kind of the right indicators and evaluation frameworks to show that, like Sarah was saying, if you don't spend this $1 extra now, you're going to lose those $2 to $10 later. We've seen how time after time at these climate conferences, young people talking about their futures and people talking about polar bears isn't getting us over the line. And I think to kind of move the needle, it's about making that business case. And in terms of what kind of people can do, I think it's about the political will. The money goes where the Treasury decides it goes. It's not the climate ministries that will be able to do this. It's going to be where governments feel they can spend. And I think as we're seeing this really worrying push towards kind of populism in Europe and elsewhere, there's this movement, or that this is kind of linked to kind of anti-wokeism and this concern that climate isn't our priority right now. We need to focus on national security, and I think to really push back against that and show that this is a priority and that there is political will mean that this financing that's required to meet our Paris obligations is maybe less likely to be totally obliterated.
That's a vital wake-up call. I'm assuming Alison and her colleague will both be able to vote in important elections this year, whether it's the European election or the American election. It's important to make sure that you're holding people to account. Kira, what can young people do? What can other people do locally or elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this question on what to learn from other treaties and such, and I think what one can learn is, for example, if we look at disarmament, you have a very strong element always of reciprocity. So you need to have transparency, and I think this is also true for emissions mitigation, that you need transparency over mitigation efforts. Maybe also learning from each other in this case is very valuable. And you need also first movers, and this may be also sort of smaller groups than the whole UNFCCC framework. It can be bilateral partnerships, it can be groups of countries, and maybe it is Germany and the United States that will move this forward together. I think there could be a very strong transatlantic component. And I don't think that we have reached capacity in this yet. So I think there's a lot of room to grow together. And then on this question of motivation and maybe also sources of hope or something, I was thinking about we talked a lot about the violent effects of climate change. So climate change in the end is a form of violence. Because it causes people to lose healthy years of their life. So either through indirect health effects, so heat waves, etc., or malnutrition, you talked about hunger, or through the eruption of conflict, etc. But compared to other conflicts, there's a huge difference, which is the motivation for this violence. It's not hate. So people are not inflicting climate change upon others because of hatred. They may be doing so neglectfully, but they're doing this mostly to maintain their lifestyle or to maintain a certain economic system that is based on exploitation of natural resources. And I think this is much easier to address than the issue of hate. So I think we can have some hope to move this conversation forward. And this may be also a narrative for the younger generation when you think about climate protection being a driver of peace.
Well, I mean, there's the idea that, the shared economy values that have trickled up, frankly, that I take a lot of courage from. And we at the Bertelsmann Foundation do a lot of work on particularly local resilience, local adaptation, and transatlantic local best practice. And as I give a lot of advice to young people now, quote unquote, when I return to my alma maters, and I always say, if you're students of political science, there's only one job for one Joe Nye in this world. But you know what? There are lots of people who need to walk down to City Hall and figure out what they can do right then and right there. And if you ask, you will receive tasks, and you will be needed. And so, as we used to say, all action, all change can be local with bigger results. Katarina, your advice.
Maybe two thoughts that come to mind, and I know we're already out of time. The first one is on youth engagement and the perception of perhaps being far removed. In fact, my path to NATO started through a Young Leaders program when in 2020 NATO was looking for fresh thinking about how it should adapt for the next decade and beyond. And I myself worked on climate chapter and climate recommendations, which then directly fed into the policy I'm now able to implement. And so there are many ways in which NATO is trying to engage with the youth, as well as other groups. The
program was literally called NATO Engages.
And so essentially, there are many ways in which you can feed into the work we do at NATO. And a second thing that came to mind when the gentleman mentioned the period of relative peace he has enjoyed. And I think NATO now celebrates 75 years, and we really have NATO and other multilateral organizations to thank for this relative peace dividend that we have had. And one thing I want to stress is that we can't really have sustainability without security. There's nothing worse for the environment than the war, and we need to continue increasing our defense investment in periods like these to ensure that we continue living in peaceful and sustainable societies, because we need to be able to defend and deter first and foremost.
Iris, what can we learn from other movements for the environmental defense movement?
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, I also have two quick thoughts, and one on young people. I consider myself a young person still too, but apparently it's all arbitrary. But I'd say honestly, keep being honest. I think that's probably like one of the most useful things that you can do, is just to keep calling facts as facts, and keep knowing that your voice does matter, that the movement that you all have does matter in moving big institutions and holding institutions accountable. I mean that with great sincerity. Even in the Department of Defense, we think about this from a recruitment perspective. Many of our younger generation airmen, sailors, soldiers, they care deeply about the climate crisis and want to see their own institution acknowledging it. So we think about that ourselves internally as not only an existential crisis from the outside that we need to respond to, but on the inside for our own talent retention. And so I just encourage you all to continue to use your voice. And know that it is being heard. And then just on, how do we use our existing frameworks and, alliance structures, what's applicable for the environmental movement. The DoD has had years of trust building and building its alliances. We often talk about through our strategies that we do everything by, with, and through our allies and partners. And it is certainly, it is very true. That is our greatest competitive advantage. And so, we've been doing that since, the end of World War II with the, in NATO, but we also have it with our National Guard, and we have a state partnership program where our states have a partnership out with foreign countries, and they spend years developing relationships, local relationships with the fellow military units from an individual state in a foreign country, and that just takes time, quite frankly. I think there's an investment in trust building that comes from that. That's why our alliances are so strong. It's because it's been over years. They don't happen overnight, but to the same degree with these partnerships. So I would lean into long-term relationships, and I wouldn't be afraid of small wins. I think the small wins are where you start to create a partnership and trust building. Sometimes with the climate crisis, it can feel too big to tackle, and therefore we just talk around in circles around generalities and then get frustrated. But to the extent that you can lean into small, tangible projects to do with one another that builds trust, that will lend itself towards success in the long run.
So if we all need better climate intelligence, you clearly are all part of the solution. We've gone from the 30,000 foot to the granular. We've gone to climate diplomacy and the idea that we need to position and reposition many of our organizations as continually learning. I think Sarah made that point. It's come out in a lot of different ways, both the cooperation, the strategic competition, whatever works, quote unquote, to continue to focus with an eye on the prize, which is, I think, to Kira's exact point, to increase the capacity of humans to exist in this ecosystem and ecospace. I think the very first way in which we can really make our voices heard and lean in is to preserve the kind of discussion formats we've had here, which is a quintessential factoid and component of our joint and resilient democracies. So in a year, as we have this one, 2024, where it feels like half the planet is voting, one way to do it is to preserve an action radius through democracy, to make your voices heard, to hold people accountable, and to be personally engaged. And that is my hope for us going out of this room and into a set of difficult conversations between now and Sunday. Everything, everywhere, all at once, all at the same time, but not without dedication. It won't get done without you, your voices, and your votes. Thanks very much for being here this evening. Thanks for being a part of this conversation. Thank you.